I pulled into Blackwood State Park as the sun started to sink behind the mountains. The place looked different at dusk, more closed in somehow. During day shifts, the trees seemed welcoming, the paths inviting. Now they just looked like walls of darkness waiting to swallow the light. The gravel crunched under my tires as I parked outside the night station cabin. I'd never actually been inside before. No reason to. Day rangers use the main office near the park entrance. This isolated outpost was Nathan's domain. I grabbed my backpack and the thermos of coffee I'd brought. Nathan had been out with pneumonia for 3 days already, and Storm had finally run out of options for coverage. When she called me this morning, I'd agreed before really thinking it through. One overnight shift couldn't be that bad, right? The cabin sat about 50 yards from the access road, a small rectangle of weathered wood with a metal roof. As I walked toward it, I noticed how quiet everything was. No bird song, no distant voices of hikers or campers, just the sound of my boots on the path and my own breathing. When I reached the door, I spotted a sheet of paper taped at eye level. The header read, "Night Shift Rules" in bold, all-caps lettering. I pulled it off and held it closer in the fading light. Night Shift Rules. 1. If fog appears around midnight, stay inside and away from windows until it clears. Do not respond to voices. 2. During storms, ignore all knocking. Do not open the door for anyone, regardless of what they say. 3. If you receive a call from any supervisor between 4 and 5 a.m., hang up immediately. 4. If you see a tall figure at the edge of the trees, turn off all lights and stay away from windows until sunrise. I read it twice, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of joke, a hazing ritual for the new guy on night shift? But I wasn't new. I'd been a ranger at Blackwood for almost 3 years, just new to nights. I unlocked the door with the key Storm had given me and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. The cabin was even smaller than it looked from outside. A desk with radio equipment and a landline phone occupied one wall. A small kitchenette with a mini fridge, microwave, and coffee maker sat in the corner. A narrow cot with a thin mattress was pushed against the far wall. 4 windows, one on each wall, faced out in all directions. The place smelled of old coffee and the pine-scented cleaner the maintenance staff used. I dropped my backpack on the desk chair and pulled out my phone. 2 bars of service. Not great, but enough to make a call. I dialed Storm's number. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Elliot." "Hey Storm, it's Cody. I made it to the night cabin." "Good. Everything okay?" I looked down at the rules paper in my hand. "Yeah, mostly. I found something weird taped to the door, though. Some list of night shift rules?" There was a pause on the other end. When Storm spoke again, her voice had changed slightly. More careful. "Oh, that. Probably just Nathan's idea of a joke. He has a strange sense of humor." "So I should ignore it?" Another pause. "What exactly does it say?" I read the 4 rules to her. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I checked my phone to make sure we hadn't lost connection. "Storm?" "It's nothing to worry about," she said finally. Her tone aimed for dismissive but missed the mark. "Just Nathan being Nathan. You know how he gets." I didn't, actually. Nathan kept to himself. We had a professional relationship, exchanging information during shift changes when our schedules overlapped, but nothing more. He wasn't exactly the office prankster type. "Are you sure? Because these seem pretty specific for a joke." "Look, Cody," Storm said, her voice firmer now. "It's one night. Just keep an eye on the park. Handle any calls that come in, and you'll be back on days tomorrow. That's all you need to worry about." "All right," I said, not entirely convinced. "If you say so." "I do. Call if there's an actual emergency. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow afternoon." She hung up before I could say anything else. I put my phone down and looked at the rules again. Storm's reaction hadn't been reassuring. If anything, it made me more curious. She'd seemed not scared exactly, but uncomfortable. like she knew something she wasn't telling me. I sat down at the desk and turned on the computer. While it booted up, I made a cup of coffee from the grounds Nathan had left. The coffee maker looked like it had seen better days, but it still worked. Once logged in, I pulled up the incident reports from the past week. Mostly routine stuff: a lost hiker who found their way back before search and rescue was mobilized, a campfire left unattended that another camper reported, a minor first aid situation with a kid who fell and scraped his knee. But as I dug deeper into the older reports, I started noticing patterns. Unusual wildlife sightings that couldn't be confirmed, hikers reporting strange sounds that rangers couldn't locate, campers cutting trips short without clear explanations. None of these were officially categorized as unexplained or supernatural. They were filed under standard headings: wildlife encounter, noise complaint, early departure. But reading between the lines, I could sense something off about them. I'd heard rumors, of course. Every park had its stories. Blackwood had more than most. Campers who wandered off trail and returned days later with no memory of where they'd been. Hikers who heard voices calling their names when they were alone. Rangers who requested transfers after particularly difficult night shifts. I'd always written these off as campfire tales, the kind of stories people tell to scare each other. But sitting alone in this cabin with those 4 specific rules in front of me, I wasn't so sure anymore. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. I got up and looked out each of the 4 windows in turn. The cabin lights created reflections that made it hard to see much beyond a few yards. The forest pressed in from all sides, a wall of black broken only by the occasional movement of branches in the light breeze. I returned to the desk and placed the rules paper directly under the lamp. I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just made up. They were too specific, too strange. Why midnight fog in particular? Why would a supervisor call between 4 and 5 in the morning? And what was the tall figure at the edge of the trees? The rational part of my brain said this was ridiculous. The park had normal natural dangers: wildlife, weather, terrain. Those were what I should be concerned about, not some cryptic list of rules that sounded like they belonged in a horror movie. But another part of me, a deeper instinct, wasn't so quick to dismiss the warnings. That part noticed how the temperature in the cabin seemed to be dropping faster than it should, even with the heating on. That part paid attention to the way the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than normal. I checked my watch, just past 9. The night stretched ahead of me, long and increasingly cold. I added another layer, the fleece I'd packed just in case, and poured more coffee. When I looked out the east-facing window again, I froze. In the distance, just visible beyond the reach of the cabin's exterior lights, a thin layer of mist was creeping between the trees. Not quite fog yet, but getting there, and it was moving toward the cabin. I thought about the first rule: if fog appears around midnight, stay inside and away from windows. It wasn't midnight yet, not even close, but watching that mist slowly advancing through the trees, I couldn't help but wonder if the rules might be worth following after all. I watched as the fog changed. It had been drifting in wisps between the trees, but now it thickened and rolled forward with purpose. This wasn't normal weather. The thin mist I'd spotted earlier had transformed into something dense and unnatural that moved like it had a mind of its own. The security lights around the cabin started to dim as the fog swallowed them. One by one, their glow turned hazy, then vanished completely. I checked my watch. 11:30. Not quite midnight, but close enough to make my skin crawl. The first rule on that paper flashed in my mind: stay inside during midnight fog and ignore voices. I backed away from the window, nearly tripping over the chair as I retreated to the center of the cabin. The fog pressed against the glass now, so thick it looked like someone had hung white sheets outside. I couldn't see anything beyond it. Not the trees, not the parking area, nothing. The cabin went completely silent. The usual forest sounds, crickets, wind in the leaves, distant owls, all vanished. Even the hum of the small refrigerator seemed muffled. The silence felt heavy, like pressure building in my ears. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel that surrounded the cabin. Someone walking with measured steps, circling the building. I froze, listening as they made a complete loop, passing each window in turn. "Cody?" My name floated through the fog, spoken in a voice that sounded almost familiar. I couldn't place it exactly. It was like hearing someone you know speaking through water. "Cody, I know you're in there." How did it know my name? Nobody was supposed to be out here. The park was closed to visitors after dark, and Storm hadn't mentioned sending anyone else out tonight. I stayed rooted in place, remembering the rule. Stay inside during midnight fog. Ignore voices. "Cody." The voice moved from the front window to the side one. "Come outside. There's something important you need to see." I grabbed my phone from the desk. No service now. The bars that had been there earlier were gone. The landline still worked, but who would I call? What would I say? That I was hearing voices in the fog. "It'll only take a minute," the voice continued, now at the back window. "Just step outside. I need your help with something." The tone was friendly, conversational, like a colleague asking for a hand with some task, but something about it raised the hair on my neck. The pitch wasn't quite right. It wavered between tones, like someone trying to remember how to sound normal. "Who's there?" I asked, immediately regretting breaking my silence. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then they started again, quicker now, heading straight to the window where I stood. "A friend," the voice answered, sounding pleased I'd responded. "Just come outside. Don't you want to know what's happening in your park?" My park. The way it said those words made my mouth go dry. I backed away from the window. "I'm on duty. I can't leave the station." A laugh came through the fog. It started normally enough, but stretched too long, turning into something that didn't sound human at all. "Always following the rules, aren't you, Cody? Just like when we worked together in Yellowstone." I never worked at Yellowstone. I'd never even been there. The voice was trying different approaches, throwing out details, hoping something would stick. I moved to the desk and picked up the rules paper again, reading the first line over and over like a mantra. The footsteps continued their circuit of the cabin, the voice calling out from different locations each time. Sometimes it sounded like Storm, other times like someone I couldn't place. It kept using my name, asking questions about people I didn't know, mentioning places I'd never been. "Your mother's worried about you, Cody. She sent me to check on you." My mother had been dead for 5 years. My hands shook as I poured myself more coffee, spilling some on the desk. I didn't drink it, my stomach was too tight, but I needed something to do with my hands. The voice grew more insistent as time passed. "You're making a mistake staying in there. There's a lost child in the woods. Don't you want to help? What kind of ranger are you?" I closed my eyes, focusing on my breathing. 20 minutes felt like hours as the voice tried everything, pleading, commanding, guilt-tripping. The footsteps sometimes rushed from window to window, other times slowly dragged along the walls. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the fog began to retreat. I watched through a small corner of the window as it pulled back into the forest, like the tide going out. The security lights flickered back to life one by one, casting their familiar glow on the empty clearing around the cabin. The voice faded with the fog, its last words barely audible. "I'll come back for you, Cody." When I was sure it was gone, I stumbled to the kitchenette. My hands shook so badly that I had to use both of them to measure the coffee grounds. I spilled half of them on the counter but managed to get enough into the filter. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, giving me something normal to focus on. The coffee maker gurgled to life. I leaned against the counter, suddenly aware of how tense my body had been. My shoulders ached and my jaw hurt from clenching it. I checked my watch again. 12:10. The whole thing had lasted less than half an hour, but it felt much longer. The night shift had barely begun. I still had hours to go before dawn. I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was some kind of prank? a local who knew rangers staffed the night station. But how would they know my name? And that fog wasn't natural. It had moved with purpose, with intelligence. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured a cup with still unsteady hands. The hot liquid scalded my tongue, but I welcomed the pain. It grounded me in reality. I sat at the desk, the rules paper now flat in front of me. The first rule stared back at me. Stay inside during midnight fog and ignore voices. I'd followed the rule and survived whatever that was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a very long night. I checked my phone for weather alerts. They'd been pinging all night. Severe thunderstorm warning, flash flood watch for the county. The radar showed a massive system sweeping across the state, and Blackwood sat right in its path. The first drops hit the cabin roof around 2. Light at first, a scattered tapping that quickly built into a steady drumbeat. I'd been fighting to stay awake after the fog incident, but the intensifying storm jolted my senses back to full alert. By 2:15, the rain hammered down with brutal force. Wind howled through the trees, bending branches at angles that made me wince. The security lights outside cast eerie, shifting shadows as the forest thrashed in the gale. I stood at the window, watching water sluice down the glass in sheets. The night had transformed into a churning mess of black and gray, visibility reduced to maybe 10 feet beyond the cabin. My coffee had gone cold. I turned away from the window to reheat it when I heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Distinct, deliberate, not the random tapping of debris blown by the wind. I froze, mug halfway to the microwave. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please help." A woman's voice called from outside, barely audible over the storm's roar. I set the mug down and moved toward the door, stopping a few feet away. "I'm stranded," the voice cried. "My car broke down on the access road. Please, I'm soaked through." Her voice cracked with what sounded like genuine terror. I pictured some poor hiker or late camper caught in this nightmare of a storm, maybe hydroplaned off the road. "Hello?" I called through the door. "I'm the park ranger. Are you hurt?" "No, but I'm freezing. My phone's dead and I've been walking for almost an hour trying to find help. Please, I think I'm getting hypothermia." My hand moved toward the deadbolt before I caught myself. Rule 2. Don't open the door during storms, no matter who knocks. I glanced at the paper on the desk, remembering the fog and that voice that knew my name, the voice that knew about my mother. "I can radio for emergency services," I said, keeping my tone professional. "What's your name and location?" "Jenny," she sobbed. "Jenny Marsh. Please, I can't feel my hands anymore. I just need to come in and warm up until help arrives. I'm right outside your door." Her story made perfect sense. The access road curved dangerously in several spots, and in this weather it would be treacherous. Cell service was spotty on good days. Everything she said tracked with what could happen to someone caught in this storm. And yet, "I'm going to call for help right now," I said, backing toward the desk where the radio sat. "Emergency services can be here in 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Her voice rose in pitch. "I won't last that long. Please, I can see your lights. I know you're in there. Just open the door." The desperation in her voice cut through me. Every bit of my ranger training screamed to help this woman. That's what we did. We helped people in trouble. We didn't leave them to freeze in thunderstorms because of some weird list of rules taped to a door. "Ma'am, I'm following protocol," I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. "I'm radioing for help now." I reached for the radio, turning the dial to the emergency channel, and just like that, the knocking stopped. I waited, hand on the radio, listening for her voice. Nothing but the howl of wind and the pounding rain. "Hello?" I called out. "Ma'am, are you still there?" Silence. I moved to the window beside the door, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the interior light. The porch was empty. The rain continued to pound down, creating a curtain of water at the edge of the covered porch. No footprints, no car lights in the distance, no sign anyone had been there at all. I checked each window in turn, scanning as far as visibility allowed. Nothing. No woman running for shelter, no figure retreating down the path. Just rain, wind, and darkness. For the next hour, I kept watch as the storm gradually weakened. The downpour thinned to a steady rain, then a drizzle. The wind died down until the trees stood almost still again, dripping quietly in the night. Throughout it all, I kept looking for any trace of the woman who had knocked. I sat at the desk, the rules paper flat in front of me. My ranger training and my conscience battled with what I'd just done, or rather, what I hadn't done. If that had been a real person, I'd left them exposed to dangerous conditions. If someone died of exposure tonight because I'd followed these bizarre rules. But something felt wrong about the whole encounter. The timing, right after the fog incident. The way the knocking had stopped the moment I reached for the radio. The complete absence of any trace outside. I picked up my pen and added notes to the paper margin. Rule 2 tested. Woman's voice during storm. Claimed car broke down. No visual confirmation. Disappeared when I offered to radio for help. The cabin felt colder somehow, despite the heating. I wrapped my hands around a fresh cup of coffee and watched the trees drip outside the windows, wondering if Jenny Marsh had ever existed at all. The phone rang, cutting through the silence of the cabin. I glanced at the digital clock on the desk. 4:20 in the morning. My hand hesitated over the receiver. Rule 3 from that paper flashed through my mind. Hang up on supervisor calls between 4 and 5 a.m. But I needed to answer to know if it was actually my supervisor. I picked up on the third ring. Blackwood Night Station, Ranger Patel speaking. Ranger Patel, this is Regional Supervisor Francisco Mendez. The voice came through with an odd formality, each word precisely enunciated. We have an urgent situation requiring your immediate attention at Campsite 7. Reports indicate suspicious activity that needs investigation right away. Something felt wrong. The voice had a strange quality to it, like it was speaking through a tunnel, with a slight echo following each word. And in my 3 years at Blackwood, I'd never heard of any supervisor named Mendez. I'm sorry, sir, I said, keeping my tone professional. Could you please verify your employee number? Standard protocol for after-hours directives. A pause hung on the line. Too long. Ranger, this is an emergency situation, the voice continued, ignoring my request. There may be campers in danger. Your immediate response is required. The voice grew more insistent, the echo more pronounced. I gripped the receiver tighter. I understand the urgency, sir, but I need verification before I can leave my post. Employee number, please. People could be hurt while you waste time with bureaucracy, the voice snapped, dropping some of its formality. I am giving you a direct order to proceed to Campsite 7 immediately. My heart rate picked up. This wasn't right. Storm had never mentioned a regional supervisor Mendez, and the way he avoided basic verification. I'm going to have to call back through official channels to confirm this directive, I said firmly, for security purposes. The voice changed then, growing louder, the strange echo more pronounced. You will go to Campsite 7 now. This is your final warning. People are in danger. The shouting continued, but I pulled the phone away from my ear and set it down on the desk. My hand was steady as I pressed the disconnect button. The phone rang again instantly. I stared at it for a second, then reached behind the desk and yanked the cord from the wall. The ringing cut off mid-chime. Adrenaline rushed through my body as I pushed back from the desk and stood up. My legs felt jittery as I began pacing around the small cabin. 3 steps one way, 4 steps the other. I rubbed my hands over my face. Was this another test? Like the fog with the voice calling my name? Like the woman in the storm who vanished? The rules on that paper had been right both times. Hang up on supervisor calls between 4 and 5 a.m. How could Nathan have known about these things? How could anyone know to write such specific warnings? I checked my watch, 4:27. Less than 2 hours until dawn. My eyes burned with exhaustion. I'd been awake most of the night, jumping at every sound, questioning every shadow. The coffee had stopped working hours ago. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest outside. I flinched, moving away from the windows. Who created these rules? Why did these things happen at such specific times? What were they? The question swirled in my mind as I continued pacing. My training had never prepared me for anything like this. Park rangers dealt with lost hikers, wildlife encounters, medical emergencies, not voices in the fog or phantom callers giving fake orders. Another sound from outside, maybe just the wind, maybe something else. I sank into the chair at the desk, keeping my back to the wall so I could see all 4 windows at once. My eyelids felt like they had weights attached. Just stay awake until sunrise, I told myself. Just a little longer. I jerked awake sometime later, not realizing I'd dozed off. The chair wasn't comfortable, but exhaustion had won temporarily. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog from my brain. My neck ached from the awkward angle. The cabin was still dark, still quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Through the windows, I could see the forest remained wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. I checked my watch, 5:15. Still some time before sunrise. I shifted in the chair, trying to find a position that wouldn't make my back hurt worse than it already did. My thoughts drifted to Nathan, wondering if he went through this every night. No wonder he looked so worn down all the time. My eyes grew heavy again despite my best efforts. I drifted into fitful sleep, jerking awake at small noises only to drift off again minutes later. The rules paper sat on the desk in front of me, a strange lifeline in this increasingly bizarre situation. Whatever might come next, I'd be ready, or at least, I hoped I would. I spotted movement through the front window at 5:40. A quick flash of something that didn't belong among the trees. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog of exhaustion from my vision. There it was again. A tall, dark silhouette stood at the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards from the cabin. I leaned closer to the window, squinting to make sure I wasn't seeing things after the long night. My stomach dropped. The figure was unnaturally tall and thin, at least 8 feet with arms and legs that looked wrong, too long for its frame. It had no features I could make out, just a solid black shape against the gray morning sky. Not a person, not anything that should exist. Rule 4. The words flashed in my mind like an alarm. I lunged for the light switch, flipping it off with shaking fingers. The desk lamp, too. I killed every source of light in the cabin, plunging myself into near darkness with only the dim, pre-dawn glow filtering through the windows. I backed away from the windows, moving in a crouch until my back hit the kitchenette counter. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched through a narrow gap in the curtains. The figure began walking toward the cabin. Walking wasn't the right word. It moved with a strange, gliding motion, as though its feet barely touched the ground. Each step covered too much distance. It moved all wrong, like someone had taken human movement and stretched it out, made it unnatural. I slid down to the floor, out of sight of the windows. The cabin felt colder than before, the air heavy and thick. A scraping sound started at the east-facing window, then moved around to the south. The thing was circling the building. A new sound started, what sounded like long fingernails tapping against the glass of each window in turn. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap, tap. The sound moved around the cabin as the figure circled. I pressed my back harder against the cabinet doors, trying to make myself as small as possible. The tapping continued its circuit. Front window, side window, back window, other side, then front again. Each time it completed a lap, the tapping grew more insistent, more deliberate. The sound stopped at the front door. I held my breath, listening to the silence. A soft click broke it. The door handle turning slowly, testing the lock. Thank God I'd engaged the deadbolt earlier. The handle jiggled again, more forcefully this time, rattling the door in its frame. I covered my mouth with my hand to keep from making any sound. The door handle stopped moving, but I could feel it out there, waiting. A long scratch dragged down the door's exterior, the sound making my skin crawl. For what felt like hours, but my watch told me was 30 minutes, the figure remained near the cabin. Sometimes it would go quiet for 5 or 6 minutes, making me wonder if it had left, only to start up again with more tapping or scratching at the walls. The sounds moved from place to place, a slow drag of those long fingers across the wooden exterior, a gentle rap at a window, the creak of a floorboard on the small porch. I stayed crouched behind the desk the whole time, barely breathing. My legs cramped and my back ached, but I didn't dare move. I kept my eyes fixed on the gap between the floor and the bottom of the desk, watching for any shadow that might indicate the thing had somehow gotten inside. The scratching at the east window became more persistent, then abruptly stopped. The silence stretched out for minutes. 5, 10, 15. No tapping, no scratching, no movement outside. I waited several more minutes, counting slowly in my head before I dared to move. My joints protested as I uncurled from my position. I crawled to the window, staying below the sill, and raised myself just enough to peek through a tiny gap in the curtains. The tree line was empty. The space between the cabin and the forest showed no sign of the tall figure. I checked each window in turn, moving carefully from one to the next, keeping low and making sure to stay hidden behind the curtains. Nothing. It was gone. I sank into the desk chair, every muscle in my body trembling with the release of tension. Outside, birds had started their morning calls. The gray sky was gradually lightening. I'd made it through the night. I heard the rumble of Nathan's truck before I saw it, the engine's familiar growl cutting through the early morning quiet. Sunlight sliced between the trees in bright shafts, catching dust motes and making them dance in the golden light. I checked my watch, 6:30 on the dot. Nathan was nothing if not punctual. My whole body ached from the night spent alternating between tense vigilance and uncomfortable dozing. I pulled myself up from the desk chair where I'd been sitting since the tall figure had disappeared, muscles protesting after hours of barely moving. A car door slammed outside. Footsteps crunched across the gravel, steady and unhurried. Then came the knock, 3 sharp raps on the door. "Cody, you in there? It's Nathan." The voice sent a flood of relief through me. A normal human voice. I moved to the window beside the door and peered through a crack in the curtain. Nathan stood on the porch looking tired but solid and real in his ranger uniform, a travel mug in one hand. The morning light caught the gray at his temples. I reached for the deadbolt with fingers that wouldn't quite steady. The lock clicked open, and I pulled the door back, wincing as sunlight hit my face. Nathan took one look at me, and his expression shifted. "Jesus, Cody, you look terrible." His eyes narrowed as he scanned my face. "Everything all right?" I opened my mouth to answer, but where would I even start? Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded paper with the rules, holding it out to him. Nathan's gaze dropped to the paper. He took it without a word, unfolded it, and began to read. His face changed as his eyes moved down the list, mouth tightening, jaw clenching. When he finished, he looked back up at me, all traces of casual morning greeting gone. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, his voice low and careful. "It was taped to the door when I got here yesterday. I thought it was a joke." Nathan folded the paper with precise movements, tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform shirt. "Was it?" "No." The word came out rough. I cleared my throat. "No, it wasn't." He looked past me into the cabin, then back at my face. "Did you follow them? The rules?" I nodded. "All of them?" "Yeah, all 4. Nathan let out a long breath, shoulders dropping slightly. He glanced around the clearing, eyes scanning the tree line before returning to me. "Listen to me carefully," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You can't tell anyone about what happened here last night. Not Storm, not any of the other rangers. Nobody. You understand? But..." "No," he cut me off, leaning in closer. I need you to swear to me right now. This stays between us." I studied his face, the deep lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw. "You know about them," I said, not a question. "The things in the rules, the fog, the knocking, the calls, the figure. You know they're real." Nathan held my gaze for a long moment. The morning birds called from the trees around us, their songs jarringly normal against the weight of our conversation. 7 years, he finally said, so quietly I almost missed it. "I've been working nights here for 7 years. He tapped his pocket where he'd put the rules. "And this list isn't a joke, Cody. It's the only reason I'm still alive." The words hung in the air between us. I felt cold despite the warming day, the memory of that tall, wrong-shaped figure still fresh in my mind. "I need to get my stuff," I said. Back inside the cabin, I gathered my things with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My backpack, the empty thermos, my jacket. Simple, everyday items that now seemed to belong to a different world, one where the rules of reality still made sense. My mind raced with questions. What were these entities that visited the cabin each night? How long had they existed in the park? The patterns in those old incident reports suddenly made much more sense. Not random occurrences, but encounters with whatever lurked in Blackwood's darkness. I zipped my backpack closed, thinking about all the rangers who'd worked nights here over the years. How many had encountered what I'd seen? And what about the ones who might not have had Nathan's rules to protect them? What happened to rangers who answered the door during storms, or took calls between 4 and 5, or left the lights on when that tall figure appeared? Nathan stood in the doorway, watching me. The morning light behind him couldn't reach the shadows in his eyes. I turned the key in the ignition of my truck and sat there for a long moment, my fingers white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The rational part of my brain kept saying I should be driving in the opposite direction, away from Blackwood State Park, away from that cabin, away from whatever the hell happened last night. But here I was, about to head back for another shift. "This is insane," I muttered to myself, glancing at the passenger seat where I'd piled my supplies. I'd spent most of the day in a fog of exhaustion, trying to sleep but mostly lying awake, replaying every moment from last night. The voice in the mist calling my name, the woman in the storm who vanished, the phone call from someone who didn't exist, the tall figure at the tree line that moved all wrong. I checked my watch. 6:30 p.m. The sun would set in less than an hour. I needed to get moving. The drive to the park took 20 minutes, my headlights cutting through the growing dusk. The trees alongside the road seemed to lean in closer than I remembered, their shadows deeper and more watchful. I turned onto the access road, gravel crunching under my tires, and followed it to the night station cabin. As I pulled up and killed the engine, the silence pressed in around me. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat and the duffel bag from the back, then made my way to the cabin door. Just like yesterday, a paper was taped at eye level, the same rules in the same handwriting. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. Desk with radio equipment and landline phone, kitchenette with mini fridge, narrow cot, 4 windows facing all directions. But now I understood what this place really was. Not just a night station, but a fortress against things that shouldn't exist. I set my bags on the desk and began unpacking methodically. From my backpack, I pulled out a leather-bound journal I'd bought at the general store on my way home this morning, along with several pens. From the duffel, I removed extra batteries, a heavy-duty flashlight that could double as a weapon if needed, a sleeping bag, and a small camping stove with fuel. "If I'm really doing this," I said to the empty room, "I'm doing it prepared." I opened the journal to its first blank page and wrote the date at the top, followed by a detailed account of everything that had happened the previous night. I wanted a record, something concrete I could reference. When I finished, I flipped to a new page and created sections: fog voice, storm, knocking, phone calls, and tall figure. The desk clock read 7:45 p.m. I had hours before midnight when the fog might return. I set up my equipment, placing the motion-activated camera I'd borrowed from the park's wildlife monitoring supplies on the desk. I checked that it was fully charged and had an empty memory card. At 8:30, I ate the sandwich I'd packed and drank coffee from my thermos. The cabin felt colder than it should have, despite the heating system running. I put on my fleece and continued my preparations. By 10 p.m., I'd positioned the camera so it could be quickly moved to any window. I'd also drawn rough diagrams of the cabin and surrounding area in my journal, marking the tree line's distance and noting potential entry points around the structure. At 11:15, I noticed the first wisps of mist between the trees. I stood at the east-facing window, watching as it thickened and began to move with that same purposeful quality I'd observed last night. "Here we go," I said, feeling my heart rate increase. I grabbed the thermometer I'd brought and placed it on the windowsill. The temperature inside the cabin was 68 degrees. As the fog approached, I watched the reading drop. 65, 63, 60. Within minutes, it had fallen to 54 degrees, though the heating was still running. In my journal, I wrote, "Temperature drops approximately 14 degrees as fog approaches. No visible source of cold. Heating system continues to run but cannot maintain temperature." The security lights around the cabin began to dim one by one as the fog enveloped them. I backed away from the window, positioned myself in the center of the room, and waited. The silence descended just like before. Crickets, wind, all natural sounds ceased. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed muffled. Then came the footsteps circling the cabin on the gravel. I grabbed my pen and wrote quickly. Footsteps sound human in weight and gait, approximately 1 circuit per minute. When the voice came, I was ready. It called my name, just like before, but this time I listened more carefully. There was something familiar about it. "Cody, are you in there? I need to talk to you about something important." I froze, pen hovering over paper. It was Storm's voice, or something trying to sound like Storm. The pitch and cadence matched, but there was that same unnatural wavering quality underneath. "I'm your supervisor, Cody. Open the door. There's been an incident we need to discuss." I wrote frantically. "Entity mimicking Storm's voice. Knows our relationship, using authority angle." The fake Storm continued circling, switching tactics when the authority approach didn't work. "Cody, please. I'm scared out here alone. Something's following me in the fog. Let me in." The pleading tone was perfect, exactly how a frightened Storm might sound. But I remembered the rules and stayed put, documenting every change in approach, every new tactic the voice tried. After 20 minutes, the fog retreated just like before, and the security lights flickered back on. I checked the thermometer, 68 degrees again. The temperature had returned to normal the moment the fog withdrew. I sat at the desk, reviewing my notes and adding observations. The entity in the fog had specifically chosen to mimic someone I knew and respected, someone with authority over me. That suggested it could access information about my relationships, or perhaps it had observed my interactions with Storm. At 1:30 a.m., my phone pinged with a weather alert. The storm was coming, just like last night. I set up the motion-activated camera on a tripod facing the front door and turned it on. Rain began hitting the roof at 1:45, quickly becoming a downpour. When the 3 distinct knocks came at the door, I was ready. A woman's voice called out, claiming to be lost, her story nearly identical to Jenny Marsh from the night before. I stood well back from the door, watching the camera's display. It showed the porch clearly, but there was no one there, just empty space where the voice seemed to be coming from. "I can see you on camera," I called out. "There's no one there." The knocking stopped instantly. The voice went silent. I checked the footage on the camera. Nothing but an empty porch being pelted by rain. No footprints formed in the wet ground. No movement triggered the motion sensor. In my journal, I wrote, "Entity not visible on digital recording." Voice seems to come from empty space. Stops when confronted with evidence of monitoring. The storm continued for another hour before gradually subsiding. I used the time to review my notes and prepare for what might come next. At 4:15 a.m., I sat staring at the phone on the desk. According to the rules, a call would come between 4 and 5. I'd been thinking about this particular phenomenon all day. Last night, I'd hung up and unplugged the phone. Today, I wanted to learn more. I'd brought a small toolkit and used it to open the junction box where the phone line entered the cabin. What I found made my skin crawl. There was no connection. The line from the phone ran to the wall but terminated in the junction box without connecting to any outside line. The phone shouldn't have been able to ring at all. At 4:22, it rang anyway. I let it ring 3 times, then picked up without speaking. Ranger Patel. The voice had that same tunnel-like quality as before. This is Regional Director Watkins. We have an emergency situation at the North Trail entrance. You need to go there immediately. I remained silent, taking notes. There was no Regional Director Watkins in our park system. Ranger Patel, acknowledge this order immediately. Lives are at stake. I still said nothing, just listened and documented. After 45 seconds of increasing demands, I hung up. The phone rang again instantly. I opened the junction box again to confirm what I already knew. The phone had no physical connection to any outside line. It shouldn't have been able to ring at all. In my journal I wrote, "Phone operates without physical connection. Entity seems to use electrical systems somehow." I disconnected the phone completely, removing it from the wall socket. It continued to ring for another 5 minutes before falling silent. By 5:30 a.m. I was exhausted but determined to observe the final phenomenon. I kept all lights on and positioned myself where I could see through a tiny crack in the curtains covering the east window. According to the rules, the tall figure would appear at the tree line. At 5:42, I saw movement at the edge of the forest. The tall, thin silhouette emerged just as it had last night, standing unnaturally still at first. But this time, I didn't immediately turn off the lights. I watched through the narrow gap for a few seconds longer. What I saw chilled me to my core. The figure wasn't solid at all. It was composed of shifting darkness that seemed to fold in on itself in impossible ways. Its limbs weren't fixed in number or position. They moved and multiplied, extending and contracting like smoke given partial substance. Its height fluctuated between 8 and 10 feet as I watched. I lurched for the light switch, plunging the cabin into darkness. Crouching below the window line, I wrote by the dim light of my flashlight, "Entity not solid, made of shifting darkness with inconsistent form. Multiple limbs moving in physically impossible ways. Height variable." The scraping sounds began at the windows, just like before. The tapping made its circuits. The door handle jiggled. I remained hidden, documenting every sound, every movement, until the entity finally retreated as the first gray light of dawn appeared on the horizon. When the birds began their morning calls, I knew I'd survived another night. I sat in the desk chair, my journal filled with observations, the camera's memory card containing footage of an empty porch where a voice had come from nothing, and the disconnected phone that had rung without any possible power source. At 6:30 a.m., Nathan's truck pulled up outside. I watched through the window as he approached the cabin, looking even more tired than yesterday. He knocked and identified himself. I checked through the curtain crack before opening the door. "You came back." Nathan's voice held equal parts surprise and respect. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "And I brought supplies." Nathan's eyes moved over the equipment I'd set up, the camera, the journal, the disconnected phone with its exposed junction box. "You've been busy," he said. I picked up my journal and handed it to him. I documented everything. Temperature drops when the fog comes. The voice was mimicking storm last night. The knocking woman doesn't show up on camera. And the phone, I gestured to the exposed wiring. It's not connected to anything, Nathan. It physically can't ring, but it does. Nathan flipped through my notes, his expression growing more serious with each page. When he reached my description of the tall figure, he stopped reading. "You saw it?" he asked quietly. "You actually looked at it?" "Just for a few seconds before I turned off the lights. It's not..." I struggled to find the words. "It's not a solid thing. It's like darkness that can move and change shape. Too many limbs, all moving wrong." Nathan closed the journal and handed it back to me. He looked older somehow, the lines in his face deeper than they'd been yesterday. "There are other stations," he said finally, "not just this one. Each has its own set of rules." I stared at him. "Other stations? With other... things?" Nathan nodded. "Different phenomena, different rules, but the same principle. Follow them or disappear." Disappear? The word hung in the air between us. Rangers who don't follow the rules don't come back for their next shift. No bodies, no evidence, just gone. Nathan moved to the window and looked out at the peaceful morning forest. 7 years I've worked nights here. I've seen 5 rangers vanish. I felt cold despite the morning sunlight now streaming through the windows. Why doesn't anyone talk about this? Why isn't there an investigation? There have been investigations. They find nothing because there's nothing to find. Nathan turned back to me. "The entities don't leave evidence, just like your camera showed nothing at the door last night." I sat down at the desk, my mind racing. We need to understand what's happening here, what these things are, why they're here, how to stop them. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "I've been trying to understand for 7 years. Alone." He looked at me, really looked at me. "But maybe with 2 of us." I met his gaze. "I'm staying on night shift. I need to know more." "It's dangerous," Nathan warned. "These things, they're testing the boundaries, learning, adapting. All the more reason to understand them." I gestured to my journal. "I'll keep documenting everything. We can compare notes, look for patterns." Nathan nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll help you understand what's happening in Blackwood." He extended his hand. "Partners?" I took his hand and shook it firmly. "Partners." Through the window, the morning sun illuminated the peaceful forest, no trace remaining of the impossible things that had stalked the night. But now I knew they were out there, waiting for darkness to fall again. And this time, I wouldn't just be surviving the night, I'd be studying the enemy. I spent weeks digging through old records with Nathan, the county archives, historical society, even the basement of the regional library where they kept the really old stuff nobody ever looked at. We'd been at it since the night we agreed to figure out what was happening at Blackwood, but the deeper we got, the less I liked what we found. "Got something," Nathan said, sliding a yellowed newspaper across the table toward me. We sat in his living room, surrounded by stacks of papers, books, and maps that had gradually taken over the space. I picked up the paper, careful not to tear the brittle edges. The headline read, "3 children missing near Blackwood area, 1932. This makes 17 disappearances I've found before the park was even established," I said, adding it to our growing timeline. "And that's just what made it into official records." Nathan nodded, rubbing his eyes. The dark circles underneath had grown more pronounced over the past weeks. The tribal records were the most telling. The Lenape called this area the testing grounds. I glanced at the photocopied pages of the anthropologist's notes we'd gotten from the university archives. The translation described the woods as a place where testing spirits dwelled and warned people to avoid staying after dark. "They had rules too," I said. "Different from ours, but the same idea. Don't answer calls in the dark. Don't look directly at the tall ones. Keep fire burning all night." "Their rules worked for centuries," Nathan said, his voice low, "until settlers came and didn't know what they were dealing with." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the wall where we'd pinned everything in chronological order. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Disappearances, strange sightings, unexplained sounds, all centered around what eventually became Blackwood State Park. The land had been donated to the state in 1956 by a logging company that had tried and failed to clear it. Their official reason: the terrain was too difficult. The records we found told a different story. 8 loggers vanished in a single night. What I don't get, I said, is why the Park Service never connected these dots. Nathan gave me a tired look. You think they don't know? Why do you think they staff that night cabin? It's containment, not protection. The thought made my stomach turn. So they just... What? Feed it new rangers who don't know what they're walking into. 5 rangers in 7 years, Cody. Nathan's voice was flat. That's what I told you. All of them gone without a trace. I looked at the rules paper we'd pinned to the center of our research wall. 4 simple rules that kept us alive. But for how long? 2 nights later, I knew something was wrong the moment I arrived at the cabin. The air felt charged, like right before a massive thunderstorm, but the sky was clear and star-filled. Nathan's truck was already parked outside, and I found him inside checking the windows. Feel that? He asked without turning around. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Yeah. What is it? Don't know. He finished checking the last window lock and turned to face me. But something's different tonight. We went through our now established routine. Camera set up, temperature gauge by the east window, backup flashlights placed strategically around the room, journal open on the desk. The familiar steps helped calm my nerves, but the strange tension in the air remained. At 10:30, my phone pinged with a weather alert. I checked the screen, feeling my heart skip. Thunderstorm warning, I said, showing Nathan the radar. Coming in from the west. But the fog always comes from the east, he said, moving to the window. And it's not midnight yet. We shared a look. The entities had patterns. The fog at midnight, knocking during storms, phone calls between 4 and 5, the tall figure just before dawn. They were predictable, and that predictability kept us alive until tonight. The first drops of rain hit the roof at 11:15. By 11:30, it was a downpour, and at 11:45, with the storm raging outside, the temperature gauge by the east window dropped from 68 to 54 in less than a minute. Both at once, Nathan whispered, moving away from the windows. That's never happened before. I watched the security lights dim as the fog rolled in, merging with the rain to create an impenetrable wall of gray outside every window. The familiar footsteps began circling the cabin, but faster than usual, splashing through puddles. The phone rang. Nathan and I stared at it. It was barely midnight. The phone calls never came until after 4. Don't answer it, Nathan said, his voice tight. I had no intention of breaking that rule. The ringing continued, 5, 6, 7 rings before stopping, then immediately started again. The knocking came next, 3 sharp raps on the front door. Cody? Nathan? It's Storm. My car broke down on the access road. Please, I need help. The voice was perfect, exactly how Storm would sound if she were caught in a storm, frightened and desperate, but we knew better. They're using both our names, I said quietly. They never did that before. Nathan nodded, his face pale in the cabin's light. They're adapting. The phone kept ringing. The knocking moved around the cabin, following the same path as the footsteps in the fog. And then, through the gray haze outside the north window, I saw it. The tall figure, standing much closer to the cabin than ever before. Nathan, I whispered, pointing. He looked and went completely still. Turn off the lights, he said. Now. I hit the switches, plunging the cabin into darkness. We crouched below the windows, listening as the chaos outside intensified. The knocking became pounding. The phone rang without pause, and now there were voices, multiple voices, calling our names. Cody, help me! It was my own voice coming from just outside the east window. "Nathan, they've got me!" My voice again, now from the south side. Nathan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "It's trying to make us think they've got the other one," he whispered. "Don't fall for it." A new sound joined the cacophony, scratching from above. Something was on the roof, moving toward the chimney. We didn't have a fireplace, just the old wood stove in the corner with its narrow pipe leading up through the ceiling. "They've never tried that before," Nathan said, his voice barely audible over the noise. We moved away from the center of the room, pressing our backs against the wall furthest from the wood stove. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Small bits of soot fell from the stovepipe. For hours we endured the assault. The entities tried everything, mimicking our voices, Storm's voice, even creating sounds like a child crying or a wounded animal whimpering. The tall figure moved from window to window, its form seeming to shift and grow each time I caught a glimpse of it. No longer just tall and thin, it now had too many limbs, moving in ways that hurt my eyes to track. "They're surrounding us," Nathan said around 3 a.m. "Look." I peered through a tiny gap in the curtains. He was right. The fog had thickened into distinct shapes, dozens of them all around the cabin, pressing closer than ever before. "Why tonight?" I whispered. "Why are they changing the pattern?" Nathan shook his head. "Maybe they're getting stronger. Maybe they're learning." At 4:30, with dawn still hours away, the assault reached its peak. The entire cabin shook with pounding. The phone rang with a shrill tone that didn't sound like a normal ring. And then came the sound of breaking glass, the small window in the bathroom that we'd covered but couldn't lock properly. "The bathroom!" I shouted, already moving. We reached the doorway just as a long, impossibly thin arm snaked through the broken window. It wasn't human, the proportions all wrong, the fingers too numerous and jointed in impossible places. It groped blindly, finding the doorknob from the inside. Nathan grabbed a flashlight and swung it like a club, connecting with the arm. There was no sound of pain, just a momentary retreat, before the arm shot forward again, this time wrapping around Nathan's wrist. "Help!" he yelled as it pulled him toward the broken window. I grabbed him around the waist, digging my heels into the floor. The thing was incredibly strong. Inch by inch, it dragged us both toward the jagged glass. Nathan's arm was already through the window up to his elbow, blood streaming from where the glass cut into his skin. "The rules," he shouted, his face contorted in pain. "We need something else." My mind raced, trying to remember anything from our research that might help. The indigenous people had kept fires burning all night. The early settlers who survived reported using prayers and rituals. "The herbs," I said suddenly, remembering a journal entry we'd found from a trapper in 1887. "In my backpack." Nathan kicked at the doorframe, temporarily halting our progress toward the window. "What herbs?" "Cedar, sage, tobacco, the mixture that old trapper wrote about." I'd collected them after reading his account, more out of curiosity than belief. "Get it," Nathan grunted, bracing himself against the doorframe with his feet. I let go and lunged for my backpack, dumping its contents on the floor. The small cloth pouch fell out among my spare clothes and notebooks. I grabbed it and the metal cup from my camping set, dumping the herbs inside. "I need fire," I shouted. "Lighter, right pocket." Nathan was losing ground, now halfway through the window. Blood covered his arm, making his grip on the door frame slippery. I fished the lighter from his pocket and sparked the herbs in the cup. They caught immediately, sending up a thick, aromatic smoke. The old trapper's journal had included words to say, a mixture of English and what I assumed was a corrupted version of Lenape. I'd written them down, skeptical but thorough. Now I recited them with desperate conviction, holding the smoking cup toward the broken window. "Fire of protection, smoke of cleansing," I began, the strange syllables feeling awkward on my tongue. "This ground is not yours to take. These souls are not yours to test." The arm holding Nathan paused. The pounding around the cabin hesitated. I continued the chant, moving closer with the smoking herbs. The arm began to retreat, pulling back through the window. Nathan fell to the floor, clutching his bloodied limb to his chest. "Keep going," he gasped. I repeated the words, louder now, holding the smoking cup toward each window in turn. The pounding stopped completely. The phone fell silent. Outside, the fog began to thin, retreating toward the trees. We stayed frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe, until the first gray light of dawn showed through the broken bathroom window. Only then did the tension break. We stayed frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe, until the first gray light of dawn showed through the broken bathroom window. Only then did the tension break. "They're gone," I said, my voice hoarse from chanting. The smoking herbs had burned down to ash in the cup, leaving only their pungent smell hanging in the air. Nathan sat on the floor, back against the wall, cradling his injured arm. Blood had soaked through his sleeve and dripped onto the linoleum. His face was ashen, making the dark circles under his eyes stand out like bruises. "Let me see that," I said, setting down the cup and kneeling beside him. He winced as I carefully rolled up his sleeve. Deep cuts ran from his wrist to his elbow where the glass had torn into his skin as the entity pulled him through the window. None looked deep enough to need stitches, but they were still bleeding steadily. "First aid kit's under the sink," Nathan said through gritted teeth. I grabbed it and cleaned the wounds as best I could, wrapping his arm with gauze and medical tape. My hands were shaking so badly I had to restart twice. "That was different," Nathan finally said as I finished. "In 7 years, I've never seen them work together like that. Never seen them change their patterns." I helped him to his feet and we made our way back to the main room. The cabin looked like a disaster zone. Papers scattered across the floor from when I dumped my backpack. The desk chair overturned. Curtains partially torn from one window. And the bathroom, glass everywhere, blood smeared on the frame and floor. "Why tonight?" I asked, carefully picking up our research notes that had fallen. "What changed?" Nathan lowered himself into the remaining chair. "Maybe it's us. We've been looking into them, documenting them. Maybe they don't like that." I thought about that as I righted the desk chair and sat down. The eastern sky was getting lighter by the minute, the familiar relief of sunrise washing over me, but this time it felt temporary. "They're learning," I said quietly. "Adapting to the rules." Nathan nodded. "The rules kept me alive for 7 years because the entities followed patterns. Now they're breaking those patterns." "Breaking the rules," I added. "Their rules, not just ours." We sat in silence as dawn fully broke, the sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the damage from the night. Birds began singing in the forest as if nothing had happened, as if the woods hadn't just tried to kill us. "That ritual," Nathan finally said, "where exactly did you find it?" I pulled out my journal, flipping to the pages where I'd copied the trapper's account. "William Blackwood, 1887. He got caught in these woods overnight during a hunting trip. Described the same phenomena we've seen. The fog, voices calling his name, something tall watching from the trees." "Blackwood," Nathan repeated. "Like the park." "Yeah. According to the county records, his family owned this land before selling it to the logging company in the 1920s. He survived by using a ritual he learned from a Lenape guide." Nathan leaned forward, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured arm. "And it worked. It actually made them back off." "Temporarily," I said. "The trapper wrote that it would only hold them at bay for a while, that they'd come back stronger next time." "Great," Nathan muttered. "So we bought ourselves what? A night? A week?" I closed my journal, thinking about everything we'd learned. "The ritual is just a band-aid. We need something more permanent." "Like what? Burning the forest down?" I shook my head. The indigenous people managed to coexist with these entities for centuries. They had rules, rituals, boundaries that worked. Then settlers came, ignored the warnings, and people started disappearing. So we need to re-establish those boundaries, Nathan said, catching my train of thought. Set terms they understand. And we need to make the Park Service acknowledge what's happening, I added. No more sending unprepared rangers into that cabin. No more pretending these are just campfire stories. Nathan looked skeptical. You think Storm and the higher-ups will believe us after they've been covering this up for years? I gestured to his bandaged arm, to the broken window, to the scattered evidence of our night from hell. They'll have to. We have documentation now. Temperature readings, camera footage, physical evidence, and we have each other as witnesses. They could still write it off. Gas leak hallucinations, animal attack, weather damage. Nathan's voice was bitter. Trust me, they've gotten good at explaining away the unexplainable. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful morning forest. Somewhere out there, the entities were waiting, learning, adapting, getting ready for next time. Then we don't give them the choice, I said, turning back to Nathan. We go public if we have to, but first, we need to figure out a more permanent solution than burning herbs and saying words I can barely pronounce. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I know someone who might be able to help, an anthropologist who specializes in Lenape culture. She reached out to me a few years ago, asking about strange occurrences in the park for a book she was writing. What did you tell her? Nothing, at the time. Nathan looked down at his bandaged arm. I was too scared of breaking the rules, too scared of what might happen if I talked about it. And now? He looked up, his expression hardening with resolve. Now I'm more scared of what happens if we don't. The sun had fully risen, bathing the cabin in warm light that belied the horrors of the night. We'd survived barely, but we both knew the entities would return, stronger and smarter than before. The rules that had protected Nathan for 7 years were no longer enough. We needed a more permanent solution, and we needed it before nightfall. I sat in the rebuilt ranger station, watching as 2 park maintenance workers installed the final reinforced window on the east-facing wall. The afternoon sun caught on the new metal frame, throwing a sharp rectangle of light across the polished hardwood floor. It had been exactly 1 year since that night when Nathan and I nearly died in the old cabin. That should do it, Ranger Patel, said Mike, the older of the 2 workers, as he tightened the last bolt. These new windows would stop a hurricane, or whatever else might come knocking. I nodded, knowing he had no idea how right he was. Thanks, guys. Looks great. After they packed up their tools and left, I walked a slow circuit around the station, running my hand along the cool metal of the shutters that could now be deployed with the push of a button. The old cabin had been completely rebuilt from the foundation up, 3 times the size, with modern amenities and safety features that would make any ranger station envious. But the improvements weren't for comfort. The reinforced windows were designed to withstand more than weather. The steel shutters could seal the building in seconds. The backup generators would keep the lights on no matter what tried to cut the power. And most importantly, though invisible to casual inspection, protective symbols had been etched into the concrete foundation before it was poured, ancient Lenape designs mixed with others from 6 protective traditions around the world. I picked up the leather-bound book from my desk. What had started as 4 simple rules taped to a door had expanded to a comprehensive manual 10 items long. Each rule was detailed with specific protocols, backed by our experiences and research. Rule 5. If the temperature drops more than 10 degrees in less than a minute, activate the herb burners in all 4 corners of the station immediately. Rule 8. Never look directly at reflective surfaces between 3:15 and 3:45 a.m. The expanded rulebook never left my desk. I knew every word by heart, but having it physically present was both practical and symbolic. It represented everything we'd learned, everything that had kept us alive. The training program for new rangers was thorough now. No one would ever again be thrown into a night shift unprepared the way I had been that first night. Every new hire spent 2 weeks in classroom training before they were allowed to shadow an experienced night ranger for another month. They learned the rules, the protocols, the warning signs. They learned about the entities, not everything, because some knowledge was too dangerous, but enough to keep them vigilant. I checked my watch. 6:30. Nathan would have been arriving for his shift by now, but he'd retired last month after 27 years with the Park Service. 7 of those years he'd spent alone, facing the entities with nothing but a handwritten list of rules. Then came our year together, documenting and surviving, building our case until we had enough evidence to force change. The Park Service had initially tried to transfer both of us after we presented our findings. When that failed, they brought in experts. First psychologists who suggested mass hallucination, then environmental specialists looking for gas leaks or contamination that might cause delusions. Finally, when we brought in our own experts, the anthropologist who confirmed the Lenape legends, the physicist who recorded the temperature drops, the audio specialist who captured voices that shouldn't exist, they had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. I pulled the first set of shutters closed as the sun began to dip toward the tree line. The entities still came every night, testing the boundaries of our defenses. They had grown more persistent after we implemented the new measures, as if angry that their hunting ground had been restricted. Last week, the fog had pressed against every window simultaneously, something I'd never seen before. The night after, knocking had come from the roof instead of the doors or windows. They were adapting, learning, but so were we. I checked the herb burners in each corner of the main room, making sure they were filled and ready. The mixture of cedar, sage, and tobacco had been supplemented with other protective elements recommended by our experts. I verified the salt lines at each threshold were unbroken. A sharp knock at the door made me jump, even though the sun was still up. I checked the newly installed security camera monitor on my desk. It showed Storm standing on the porch with a cardboard box in her arms. I opened the door, letting in the warm evening air. "Hey, Storm." "Evening, Cody. Brought those supplies you requested." She handed me the box, which was heavier than it looked. Extra batteries, those special candles, and the books from Dr. Winters. Storm looked different than she had a year ago. The skeptical administrator had been replaced by someone who had seen enough evidence to believe, even if she never talked about it directly. She'd been instrumental in pushing through the funding for the rebuilt station and the new protocols. "Thanks, I appreciate the rushed delivery." She glanced past me at the herb burners and the symbols carved into the doorframe. "All set for tonight? Just finishing preparations now." She nodded, hesitating like she wanted to say more. Finally, she just said, "Radio check at 9, midnight, and 3, as usual. I'll be here." "I know you will." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Cody, what you and Nathan did, making sure no one else would go through what you did, it matters." I smiled. "Thanks, Storm." I watched her drive away, her headlights cutting through the gathering shadows as she followed the access road back toward the main park offices. The sun was now just a sliver above the trees, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Back inside, I locked the reinforced door and began my methodical nightly ritual. I checked each window shutter, tested the radio system, verified the backup generator was fueled and ready. I placed my phone in the special lead-lined box that somehow, according to the physicist, helped prevent the entities from manipulating electronic signals. I set out my notebook and pens, ready to document whatever new tactics they might try tonight. That had become my purpose, to survive each night and record what I learned, adding to our understanding of these entities and how to defend against them. The original rules had saved my life, and now our expanded knowledge was saving others. As the last light faded from the sky, I sat at my desk with the rulebook open before me. The forest outside was beautiful in daylight, peaceful, natural, alive with normal wildlife and happy visitors. But at night, it transformed into something else, something ancient and dangerous that had been testing humans for centuries. The first security light clicked on automatically outside, casting a pool of brightness against the encroaching darkness. I was ready. The entities would come, as they always did, testing the boundaries, looking for weaknesses, trying to find a way in. But I knew the rules now, and that knowledge made all the difference.